This podcast is brought to you through support from our partner, the Calliopeia Foundation. The Calliopeia Foundation envisions a future grounded in compassion, respect, dignity, reverence for nature, and care for each other in the earth. To learn more, visit calliopeia.org.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young.
The soil food web, the micro and macroorganisms deserve the majority of the praise, and us humans get to really learn from the inner workings and really apply this new knowledge learned into other areas and aspects of our lives.
Today we are speaking with Michael Martinez. Michael is a certified master gardener, a former elementary school teacher, and the founder and executive director of LA Compost. Michael has over 8 years of experience building gardens and compost systems throughout the county of Los Angeles, as well as other parts of the country. Michael has grown LA Compost from a group of volunteers collecting organics with bikes to a decentralized network of community compost hubs that span across the most populated county in the country. Well, Michael, thank you for being on the show. I'm really looking forward to diving into a big heap of compost in this conversation with you. As I love compost, I watch the magnificence that it creates in the soil, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Likewise. Thank you so much for your time and for allowing this conversation to even take place.
Absolutely. Well, I'd love to begin our conversation both with a little more information on the origins of LA Compost, as well as talking about compost in relation to climate change. So perhaps you can begin by recounting the impetus for starting LA Compost back in 2013, and then share a little bit more on how composting increases carbon sequestration, mitigates harmful emissions, and nourishes the resiliency of land in the face of both flooding and drought.
Yeah, absolutely. So born and raised in Los Angeles, I feel like the seeds of LA Compost were planted early on, but they kind of germinated while I was a teacher in Miami, Florida. I had the opportunity to teach fifth grade reading and writing for a few years in Miami, and I would always use garden symbols or metaphors just to kind of teach my kids the basics of reading and writing proficiency. And one day I used kind of like a seed as an example of just themselves and how they need to be watered and nurtured, and there's going to be things along the way that might try to dig them up, or weeds that try to choke their roots, and really just using the seed as a metaphor to show them that once they blossom and bloom and or grow into a tree, they not only create life, shade, and protection for other things, but they are part of this beautiful ecosystem. And these conversations kind of kept going, and one day we were talking about plants and food outside after lunchtime, and one of my students kind of just asked me, "Mr. Martinez, how do hot Cheetos grow?" And it was kind of a pause for me to see if they were serious. When I quickly realized that they were, it was an opportunity for it to be a teachable moment, to follow up questions such as, where do carrots come from? They pointed to the local supermarket. I said, where do they get it from? They pointed to the local delivery truck. I said, where did the delivery truck get it from? And there was a kind of a stop in the conversation there as far as where food actually came from. We started a small garden in that elementary school, and it was nothing profound or beautiful in comparison to the many community gardens and school gardens that are across the country. But what it did was, for the first time, provided an opportunity for students to construct their own knowledge, feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves, facilitate their learning, and actually see a seed grow from seed to carrot, from seed to broccoli head, and actually have a little sense of investment, ownership, and appreciation for the story of food. And for me, that beautiful transformation of appreciating food and understanding its entire story from seed to table to the compost back to the seed was really beautiful. And that garden is still going to this day. But LA has always been home. It's where family is from. It's where friends are. It's where I consider my roots. So coming back to LA Compost started with this idea of how do we create that transformative experience to allow people to appreciate and understand the entire cycle of food. So we started on bikes, collecting food scraps from local restaurants, coffee shops, juice bars, and collect about 30,000 pounds in the first few months. Composted all in friends and family's backyards. The compost we created, we gave away at farmers markets. The donations we received, we were able to build school gardens with. And it was this really cool, awesome opportunity to talk about soil and compost and nutrient dense food all around with materials that we were often throwing away. In 2014, we made the shift of not just being a service, but of actually creating centers and hubs that engage and allow for active participation from the residents. So now we function in a more decentralized community compost hubs. These hubs are in schools, churches, museums, community gardens, art centers, housing projects, anywhere where there's food, people, and an opportunity for compost education and application to take place. We can kind of build the compost infrastructure and the educational platform for that to take place. As a former teacher, I'm a firm believer that education is only as strong as the opportunity and access that you give the learner to put in practice what was learned. Oftentimes, it can just become verbal junk mail of telling people what they need to change in their lifestyles or habits, but giving them real life space and access to put it into practice either in their backyard, in their school, in their church or community garden has been really life-giving and a real beautiful thing. Oftentimes with the climate change conversation, here specifically in California and Los Angeles, we experienced some catastrophic fires this past year, as well as some mudslides and flooding shortly after with the rains. And it's all related to the health of our soil and the health of our climate here within the Los Angeles County. Compost does a ton of good, which you mentioned in regards to carbon sequestration through the natural process of photosynthesis and uptaking carbon and storing it in the ground, as well as building some nice porosity and structure in the soil so that when it does rain, it's not just falling on cement, but porous sponge-like soil that can retain that water, hold that water, as well as filter a lot of the pollutants within that water as well. Oftentimes people kind of can feel hopeless because it's such a big issue of whether we're talking about global warming or just food systems or droughts and watersheds. But what's beautiful and what we've seen with this work is that we're really establishing this human network, that individual acts of good, whether it's diverting food scraps at your local community garden, whether it's doing it at home, whether it's working with food recovery agencies, the effects that has over time when you actually look at it from a macro level is really incredible. Someone's 3 pounds dropped off at a farmer's market might not seem much, but the fact that every market is diverting 1,000 pounds, the fact that every hub is diverting X amount of tons per year, and little by little, you start to see this beautiful array of people doing good and actually having a collective impact, because changing culture, routines, and habits isn't a microwave approach. It can't happen overnight. So it's definitely an approach we've taken of engaging with the community, showing the good that they are already doing, adding value to existing programs at our hub locations, and understanding that it's an all hands on deck collective effort needed to really make the changes that are needed in the communities that we're serving.
I don't like the word hope, but it feels hopeful hearing these stories of regeneration and community involvement, and that we really need to get out of this idea that things are too small or it's not enough, or our 3 pounds of compost doesn't really make a difference when it does. These small acts that are individually ours, our responsibility. And when we can come together in coalition and community and make a difference, I think it instills a sense of ownership, like you were saying, when people can invest in the seed to the broccoli head and really see the beauty in that, and also understand exactly how much their contribution really matters. And I think it's a really good message for all of us. Sometimes the urgency and the monstrosity of the issues keeps us from actually getting involved in little ways because we think it won't matter when it does. And so I really appreciate hearing your stories.
And it's twofold. It's how do we play well with others, understanding that it's going to require a holistic approach from all parties involved, from haulers, municipalities, individuals, communities, et cetera. But how do we look at the food in like a hierarchy lens, right? As far as like, it's not just purchase food and compost, but it's like source reduction, it's edible food rescue and feeding people first who are actually hungry. It's home composting. It's really looking at it and understanding food has high value, even when we consider it no longer having value in our own households. And yeah, it's definitely a matter of, it's not going to be one singular solution that's going to change the game. It's going to require diversified, holistic approach from decentralized and centralized and micro and macro level approaches. And unfortunately, there's enough waste and problems to go around for everyone to really tackle and chew off a bit of it.
Absolutely.
But I agree with you. I don't like to just throw hope out there, but it is very much life-giving to see humans showing humanity and recognizing that we don't just have to forget about the issue or say, well, it's too big for us. Let's just hope that it goes the way I hope it goes, kind of thing. But actually making real life changes in our communities. And some of the communities that we work with don't have a political voice or don't have the purchasing power or opportunities and access to change their specific climates and systems as well. And when you talk about resiliency or climate change or disasters, communities of color and disadvantaged communities are oftentimes not oftentimes, are always the communities who are given resources last or are not well prepared to handle those. So how do we build resiliency within the community on a block by block, zip code by zip code level of just educating and equipping, empowering people to know what they're capable of doing, and we're seeing that, and it's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about the statistics around food waste, as we've mentioned it a few times so far. And looking at the statistics, they just continue to be outrageous. For example, the agricultural industry in this country has to use over 20% of our fresh water supply to grow the amount of food that ends up getting thrown away. In fact, food waste is one of the biggest occupants in our landfills. So I'd really like to open up this conversation to you, either in terms of the grave disparity you see in LA between the amount of food that is thrown away versus the percentage of residents who struggle to feed themselves and their families, or in regards to why our government fails to address this issue through policy. And I just want to say, comparatively, France banned supermarkets from throwing away food, and Germany is completely reforming their expiration date system. So why are we so resistant towards centering conversations around food waste?
I think it's kind of twofold. From the stats you listed, it is pretty insane to think that 40 to 50% of all the food that we grow kind of just goes straight to the trash. And here in LA, it's about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 Angelinos don't know where their next meal is going to come from. I think we have this idea of perfection of what food should look like in some areas. We've kind of been conditioned to go to a supermarket or a grocery store and see carrots look shiny or apples, waxed and polished. And when carrots are hugging or lemons have pimples or tomatoes are partially not in the same form or shape in which we're accustomed or expect them to be, we consider those as not having the same amount of value as something that is perfect or whole. And I think that's affected the farmers in a lot of ways, in the sense that there's a lot of waste if a carrot is too small or apple is misformed. So there's a lot of waste on that end. And then there's a lot of waste from the fact that there's so much energy, as you mentioned, water, gas, human power to actually harvest and clean and wash and chop and prep, and then actually getting to the place where it's sold. There's a ton of waste there as well. And what's insane here in Los Angeles is we have one of the largest produce hubs here in downtown Los Angeles, where a lot of the wholesale fruit comes every morning from different farmers in the central northern areas of the state. Yet all that food passes by one of the most highest concentrated homeless population and food insecure populations every morning as well. So there's a huge issue of the amount of energy and resources that we're putting into this, as well as the amount of energy and resources that we're putting into actually disposing of this food, as well as a ton of energy and resources into actually trying to figure out what to do with food insecure individuals. And I think from the policy standpoint, a lot of times it's fear-based from supermarkets, grocery stores, and even small coffee shops. We really put our entire being and trust into expiration dates, which is pretty absurd. But being in a sue-heavy state like California, I feel like there's always the concern of the liabilities of, if I were to donate food and someone were to get sick, then I am liable for that, and I don't want to take that risk, so I'd rather just be safe and throw it away. But there's the Good Samaritan Act. There's an incredible amount of good work happening here in Los Angeles to actually put business owners, restaurants, and other organizations that can donate edible produce at ease, and allowing them to know and setting them up with the right resources with organizations that can capture that food and get it to the appropriate communities and individuals. But it's multi-tiered, from the actual farm to where the food is sold to how it's disposed and where it goes and how far it travels. So yeah, I whenever we teach workshops, I always talk about lawns and how the function of the lawn. We spend so much water to fertilize and water and pay someone to mow it and blow it and make it look pretty. And then we pay someone to dispose it, when the very piece of grass itself has the nutrients and water to support the growth of that lawn. And I think of food as just like, how do we build systems in place and, again, connect the appropriate partners and parties involved to really close these gaps and bridge these areas that don't have to exist for as long as they've had.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I just want to also read one more quote that I found in The Guardian about a report that was released last week. And it was that roughly 50% of all produce in the United States is thrown away. Some 60 million tons or $160 billion worth of produce annually, an amount constituting 1/3 of all foodstuffs. So this is a huge, huge issue that is overlooked. And I'm really grateful that you are not overlooking them. And I think there's a very few of us thinking about where our food comes from, but really even less we're thinking about where our food is ending up. And the total disregard is a manifestation of our culture of disposability. So I'm wondering, how is LA Compost seeking to retell the story of food in terms of its purpose and its function beyond just the plate? And what is the cultural work that needs to be done around our understanding of waste and trash? And why is food waste really the perfect place to start doing that?
I think it's the perfect place to start the conversation because it's the common denominator of what we all practice. It doesn't matter how you look, where you live, what your social location is, or what you believe. We all eat, hopefully, one or two or a few times during the week. And it naturally allows for that conversation to be had. And to your point, we always like to start our workshops with, there is no such thing as a way. We've been conditioned to this process of putting materials in a black, blue, green, brown, whatever color bin we have. It gets picked up on a certain day and then it's gone. And then we feel great, it's because it's not in our backyard. It's not in our landscape. It's out of sight, out of mind. We don't think about it. But as we know, that's not the case. It's traveling very far away. It's traveling to certain communities where it has to be sorted. Then it's probably transferred even further away where it's affecting communities where its final destination is located as well. I grew up not too far from the Puente Hills landfill here in LA County, which before it closed down, it was one of the largest landfills in the country. So I think it's really important for us to start talking about this linear economy, specifically this disposable economy and culture that we're in. We buy, we use, we waste, and we start over. And how do we start to transition to more of a circular economy where it's buy, use, fix, repair, share, exchange, and looking at things as having value and extending the value of things. And when it comes to food, there is always value in food, no matter what stage of life you're looking at it. So the thing is, we can implement a lot of policies where everyone has to start composting as of yesterday, but then the conversation has to come up of, well, where do we take it? And here in LA County, that's kind of what we're running into. We want to compost because there's state policy and bans that are going to require us to perform organics diversion from landfills. But where are the sites and locations that we can actually compost? The county at the moment, even with the proposed facility, still has a shortfall of about 1,500 tons per day of organics that are unaccounted for. Here in LA, we have kind of 3 sites. One site that can process kind of manures and mulches. One site that's on the west side that is Hyperion wastewater treatment. And we have like Griffith Park and a bunch of transfer stations. But we're trying to look at infrastructure on all levels and not just large tech-based infrastructure. We understand that's needed, but there's something about managing waste and creating solutions for food scraps and seeing it not as waste, but as a resource. And that happens at the individual level who's actually creating this excess to begin with. Because if all we're doing is focusing on the infrastructure that's needed to manage and process this material, but not focused on the individual consumers who are actually creating this to begin with, then we're playing backwards here. So we understand the cities need to be involved, the counties and states and local haulers need to be involved, but the consumer and individual communities need to be at the forefront of this conversation as well. And yes, we're not producing the same amount of compost or finished product as a large farm or a compost facility that has the space and acreage and staff to do so. but there's something really powerful about changing the habits and routines of an individual that over time, as I mentioned earlier, has a collective impact across the county. A lot of people living in LA aren't from LA. So when they come to LA, they say, well, my city had this kind of composting set up. I'm really surprised that LA is kind of really behind on this. And we're really working with them to provide them with options and solutions, and now engaging with the city to see how we can support and partner with their pilot programs as well. But it's all about telling the story of food. And Robert Ager always said neither food nor people should ever go to waste, and really circling it back and using food in the compost pile to be somewhat of a mirror for their own lives and their own journeys, and understanding that we are all broken, we are all incomplete, but it's the collective brokenness and collective incompleteness of our little zip codes and communities that allows us to go on the path of wholeness and creating something that is good and is of value. And we always use the compost pile as that metaphor and teaching tool and symbol to represent the communities that we're trying to create, communities that are resilient, communities that are selfless, communities that are willing to share and exchange and participate in this inhale, exhale process of, as much as you learn and are equipped with new knowledge and skills and information, being able to transfer that and pour that out to someone else. But if we were to just focus on the lack of infrastructure and the doom and gloom of the world, then not a lot of people would be encouraged to participate. But I'm really excited about just the way in which this is growing, not only in Los Angeles, but across the country and other parts of the world as well, of decentralized networks of community composters working hand in hand with municipalities, youth, haulers, cities, and counties to really look at food with a new lens.
It comes as quickly as it goes. I wonder why it ever came at all. Will it teach you? Can it reach you? Does it need to? Hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. Hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. Hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. Hear no baby screaming fits of rage, see no parade of the disarray. Speak no evil, it will only come back to haunt you. Be an optimist, baby, when shit is driving you crazy, and you're wondering what's gonna come next, what'll come next, what's gonna come next, what'll come next, what's gonna come next, what'll come next.
When the community is involved and projects are decentralized, the community can also act as a watchdog to what the government or these bigger entities are doing in terms of compost remediation, water management, any of those things. Because if we're not going to get involved behind the curtain and we're just going to say, oh, well, I hope they're doing a good job, we've seen that there hasn't been a lot of good jobs being done, or we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. And so I think community involvement in that way is really important too, that we actually understand what are the processes being done behind what I like to call the curtain, or whatever we want to call it. And so there's so much benefit for people getting involved with LA Compost and the work that y'all are doing. I feel like we could go down a rabbit hole of how one thing can lead to another. And I also been thinking the whole idea of composting, it's not new or a fringe idea. It's this practical solution that has been referenced in texts like the Bhagavad Gita and many ancient Chinese scripts. In fact, it's known that the Egyptians were early composters and that Cleopatra even declared earthworms sacred upon witnessing their composting abilities, making the removal or injury of earthworms punishable by death. So it's really incredible just to look back at humans' relationship to compost for thousands of years. And then I look at groups like LA Compost, and while composting itself is nothing new, I think what you all are doing with highlighting the relationship between composting and community is something that's so important. And I'm just wondering, how does composting make visible the beauty of decomposition or the inherent value of community members?
Yeah, and I think it's taking this backyard practice for so many years and putting it in the front yard and putting it at the street and eye level of people to see it as something that isn't just. We have to work on demystifying the process of compost and what it is, because oftentimes when I ask what is compost, people say manure or flies or raccoons, or a lot of scary images come when people think of composting. But what we get to do is we kind of work on building large piles too at some larger centers to allow for community activation and turning, like community turn days. But what's nice is when you look at the compost process, it's focusing kind of like on death, decay, decomposition towards something new. And we typically look at food scraps or materials that we use in our piles as us in a lot of ways. It's going back to the conversation of we're all dealing with something, and it's the collective prunings or the collective not whole or imperfect materials that come and work together and go through this heat decayed process with a lot of macro and microorganisms involved. And out on the other end, it doesn't look like what was initially put in. And I think in our own journeys, we're all dealing with our internal composting journey or process as well. There's things that we have to let go in our lives. There's things that can sometimes be taking more life from us. So when I talk about the compost pile, I always try to say that we're looking into the community as well. It's this beautiful image of community coexisting well to create something that is life-giving, that protects soil, that stores and holds water, and making it visible, allowing a kid to take a break from the iPhone and hold a few hundred worms. And it's always beautiful when there's that transfer of life with the child and worms, because they kind of malfunction. It's like we're so overstimulated today, but when you just kind of hold worms and see them move throughout your hands, it's a beautiful like pause for kids or adults to be reminded of their humanity and understand that we don't have to be in a park or a forest or anywhere to experience nature. Nature is all around us. And in the Los Angeles environment that we cover our soils in brick, concrete, asphalt, cement, and concrete, allowing them to remember soil and compost and the relation that we have with it. And it's really beautiful when people kind of have the aha moments, both in person with us, but also like a week or two after. And our job isn't to create communities that are solely dependent on our systems. Our job is to really disciple and work with community partners to be educated and empowered to be able to do this work on their own. I never like to use master composter or anything like that, because I am such a student of this game in so many ways. I did not create this term. This has been going on for as far back as we can look and research, but getting to work with so many communities across LA, I am constantly learning about the process, about their techniques, about how they apply it in their garden or landscape. And it's this beautiful transfer of knowledge that's always coming, that I'm always be able to participate. And what's also nice is that I don't manage all the hubs. We have an incredible team where we've hired from within the communities. So our hub managers manage clusters of hubs that are from the communities that they either have worked in for many years or that they've kind of been born and raised in. So although I'm from LA, I can't claim all of Los Angeles. So it's nice to still have this decentralized model where we can have lead garden, like compost stewards that can help facilitate conversations, but not just be seen as the one-all be-all experts, but really allow for knowledge and new information to be shared and learned. But it really is just demystifying what compost is, the power it has, what it looks like, from food scraps to cooking to finished, and really putting people's minds and hearts at ease, understanding that it's not scary, it's beneficial, it's something that they can participate as much or as little as they'd like to, whether it's dropping off food scraps at one of our drop-off locations, whether it's volunteering, or whether it's doing what we hope everyone does, and that's trying to compost in their own space and landscape. So
I'd like to transition towards a conversation on the benefits of being in an intimate relationship with soil, as well as the practicality of soil health. So perhaps we can begin with the latter. It's no surprise that land degradation and soil infertility are serious concerns. For example, last year it was reported that we are losing fertile soil at a rate of 24 billion metric tons per year, mainly due to industrial agricultural practices. But a lesser talked about issue is the quality of soil that surrounds us in our day-to-day life. Much of the soil in this country is contaminated with lead, arsenic, old paint, gasoline, and other heavy metals. So I was wondering if you could speak to the toxicity of soil in communities across the country in relationship to the work you do in aiding the creation of nutrient-rich soils.
Yeah, we always like to kind of have the conversation around everything that is alive has protection or a covering in some way. Humans have skin, birds have feathers, fish have scales, bears have fur, but sometimes we forget that the soil is alive and that the soil requires protection or covering, either in the form of some type of organic matter or material such as mulch or compost. So we like to talk about the many co-benefits that compost has, especially in urban environments, when we talk about just how compost improves the biological, chemical, and physical characteristics of soil. And the list goes on. We talk about how it enhances plant disease suppression. We talked about how it can support the defense against erosion and as well as kind of that resilience model of when it does rain, how it's able to store, but the ability to improve water retention, the soil structure, and its ability to just serve as that filter and sponge to kind of immobilize pollutants and really improve water quality is huge. But it's really allowing people to see the many benefits and seeing how those benefits kind of work and play in their environment, whether it's in their parkways, in their backyards, in their container gardens. And, there's been a lot of studies in regards to just like fungi and the mycology and how like toxic soils and certain microbes can actually bind these materials. But, it's just, as a former elementary school teacher, I try to just simplify it as much as I can in regards to things that are alive need covering. Compost has all these benefits. We can create it in our communities for free. And it is a resource that we can keep in our communities to support the life underneath our feet, in the air, and on the ground in these ways. We work with a housing project, which to me is one of the most life-giving hubs that we have, because it was mothers who were sick and tired of their plants being sprayed with chemicals and their gardens being torn out. So they created a gated community garden, and now they grow a large portion of their own food. They have a compost bin, a worm bin. They have Monday workshops and potlucks. And to me, it's when you go there, it's often not the nicest of places when you look at housing and infrastructure. But when you're in that garden, you're in a slice, you have this beautiful oasis that they created themselves and made a beautiful reality for them to function. Even there's schools in South Los Angeles where you have planes flying over every 30 seconds. You have to kind of go on a scavenger hunt to find a tree. There's not a lot of greenery, but one of our hubs, there's several partners that have worked on creating native gardens, windrowing compost, worm bins, orchards, and really allowing these youth to participate in the benefits that compost has in relation to the ecosystem and space that they've created. But yeah, I'm always blown away that the deeper I dive into the benefits of compost and what it can do, even from just a stress relief, kind of being able to breathe and be still and not think about all the bills and complexities of life. There have been studies of just like the way in which it serves also as a de-stressor when you kind of breathe are in this space. And I always relate it to when you're able to go on a hike in the forest or in nature after a rain, or just even away from the noise of streets and freeways. And, you know, our staff, our volunteers, the people we work with always leave the space feeling full, not because we're feeding them, but because of the activity and the presence that compost has, and the energy and the transfer of energy that's taking place in that space.
Mm-hmm. I was just about to ask you about the intangible impacts of working with compost. And it was perfect timing about, how you were talking about the de-stressing qualities, because I was also reading that there are psychological health benefits, specifically bacteria found in soils work similarly to antidepressants. And, as you were saying, especially those who are living in urban areas with the noise and the freeways, most people are severely removed from any interaction and connection with soil. But getting our hands dirty has really proven to not just be good for the earth, but for us, for our communities. And I would love if you could speak more to the importance of reclaiming historic and ancestral relationships to the earth, especially in urban spaces.
Yeah, I feel really privileged and fortunate to be able to witness and experience the ways in which many communities we work with engage with the land and engage with nature and their microclimates. I also have a 2-year-old son who gets to join me and visit a lot of these hubs. And it is normal for him to dive into a big pile of compost. It is normal for him to grab a handful of worms or bite off a head of broccoli that is already flowering in our garden. And it's really great to see the ways in which we're reconnecting to what is so natural to us. We're not trying to just create these grounding experiences where people just, take off their shoes and jump in the compost pile. It's a lot of work involved, and in the natural sifting and turning and watering and mulching and chopping. People are getting dirty. People are touching the compost. What's always nice is when a group of 20 college volunteers start with gloves in their hands, and then by the end, only about 4 of them still have gloves, and the rest of them are just bare hand in the soil, sifting and turning and engaging, asking questions. What's this bug? What's this white spider web looking thing? And it's always a teachable moment to really engage with people. And the aha moments, as I said, are typically happening there, but it's always nice to get the email afterwards and hear that they had a great experience and that they want to participate again. But I always enjoy seeing how people engage with the compost. Some volunteers, it's kind of their replacement for the gym membership in a lot of ways, because of the physical energy that's actually going into turning these large piles and managing these large piles. I personally haven't gotten a cold in like 5 or 6 years, and I'd be lying if I said I knew the science behind that. But being around the amount of bacteria and fungi in the soil fluid that I am around, I can't imagine that I imagine that's partially because of that. And it's really great to see people not only engaging with our spaces that we create, but bringing the stories of their own home or their own community or their family's homes and how it relates to the experience they're having in these spaces that we have as well. What's so nice about every single one of our hubs is that it's in partnership with an existing organization. So we're not coming to say what to change or how to do certain things. We're adding value to what's already going on. So we oftentimes get to come into a space, whether it's a community garden, church, or art center, and there's already beautiful interactions with the soil, with the native plants, with the trees and shrubs that are going on. So we just get to add another element for people to get involved with that.
Just like other urban areas across the country, LA has not been designed to be an energy efficient city or community oriented or sustainable city, really, in most ways. But in other ways, this has actually empowered, not discouraged, a variety of groups and initiatives to create regenerative and sustainable resource cycles. I'm even thinking of the ongoing movement to soften our cities, where communities in Detroit, Portland, and Nashville, and I'm sure others, are reimagining concrete heavy spaces with urban gardens and graveled pathways. And This is not only an aesthetically pleasing movement, it's also really a form of climate adaptation in the sense that cement pavement contributes to heavier flooding and toxic storm water runoff. So I'd really like to talk to you about what it means to reclaim city spaces for ourselves and how the so-called greening of a community is also community empowerment, especially in the context of structural inequality.
Absolutely. I always internally feel like I can determine the wealth of a neighborhood based off its tree canopy or just the amount of green space. Some neighborhoods you're always walking in shade, where others you're walking either in the shade of an airplane or power lines or something along those areas. But there's some really beautiful organizations here in Los Angeles that are doing just that, that are reclaiming underutilized vacant lots, parking lots, alleyways, and turning them into spaces where communities can coexist and engage with them in a new way. Lot to Spot comes to mind. Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust comes to mind. They're working on really creating beautiful areas where people can be proud of their neighborhoods and have access to more green spaces, because there are plenty of parks across LA, but there's definitely not enough, and there can always be more green spaces. So I'm always encouraged, to your point, of these organizations that are transforming these vacant lot, these properties that allow for communities to engage in a deeper way. And we just get to participate in that as well. There's organizations like Los Angeles Community Garden Council that supports the growth and upkeep in community gardens. And we are able to kind of work alongside of them and establish community compost hubs to support the soil health and the compost creation in those spaces. But I think even with the city, they've also come out with these specific policies that encourage landowners who have vacant properties to use them, or to encourage urban agricultural incentive zones to give those property owners a tax incentive break if they were to lend their vacant lot or property to be used for greening, food growing purposes. And although I haven't seen a ton of people utilize this program, it is still new, and I'm encouraged that even exists. So I think we definitely are thinking of LA in a new light. To your point, we're not just a vacant lot altogether, but there are pockets of goodness that can be rethought, reimagined, and transformed into something that is life-giving. And again, I think it contributes to the decentralized model that we're working in. We're mimicking the soil food web in that it's all about partnerships. It's all about sharing and passing of nutrients. It's all about working together, as small as we are, for this bigger picture that is Los Angeles, 10 million people.
I've been working hard. I've been working, oh help me Lord. I've been thinking hard. I've been thinking, oh help me Lord. So I'm wired, firemen's and rent through the fire. I spend my days, I spend my nights far away, far from the light. Afraid to speak a word of truth, afraid to know. While brothers die, sisters cry, and souls grow cold. What can we do? What can we do? Chains are two, even if you break one, the other won't. Working hard, I've been working, oh help me Lord. I've been thinking hard, I've been thinking, oh help me Lord.
As much as this is about self-realization and community creation, I'm still really interested in the role of local governments, especially seeing how structures like the Department of Sanitation are key players in networks of waste relations. And I wonder if you have thoughts on creative ways of partnering with state policymakers or state-sponsored programs to tackle large food waste issues, and also whether or not you think it's feasible for local governments to start incentivizing home and community compost in terms of providing training or guidance, equipment, or even, I don't know, tax write-offs.
Yeah, we're a little bit involved with everything from the national macro level. We are on the steering committee with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is based on the East Coast, and they're kind of the big facilitators around community composting for a lot of the community composters across the country. We kind of are participants and helped form the California Alliance for Community Composters, which works with composters from the Bay Area down to San Diego and between, and really working on assembly and assembly bills that we feel like we can support and work with. And then at the local level, we're also working with the Board of Public Works and in conversations with sanitation, both in City Hall in participation with the Food Waste Task Force, as well as at the community level as well. But the thing is, there's blueprints for this to work. We're not recreating the wheel, one with compost or with municipalities working in partnership with nonprofits. I think New York is an incredible model to look at as far as how their sanitation department is working with nonprofits to manage resources locally, to manage food scraps locally through both their farmers market drop-off programs, through their decentralized hubs as well that are able to process in creative spaces like under the Brooklyn Bridge and different areas throughout New York City. And I think LA is right around the corner of implementing something similar. Not carbon copy, because we are not New York and New York is not LA, but something that fits our needs. And I think sanitation is one, sees the state mandated goals that CalRecycle is putting forward, but two, also realizing that it's going to take all hands on deck and creative approaches to really meet these demands and requirements. So LA Sanitation is already kind of implementing some pilot programs, and we are deep in discussion with them to see how we can further work together, because this work you can't work in silos in this work. Collaboration, partnership, and being able to play well with one another is absolutely needed. And I think there's so many benefits to working well and playing well with one another. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, there's enough food and organic material to go around. And I think there needs to be incentives for community composting, because we are in the public eye. We are the human piece of this larger puzzle, and we are assisting in the overall goals that the state is putting out as well. So I think CalRecycle, the state governing agency, has come a long way and has really seen the importance of community composting. It's a matter of us community composters to define what it is we do, what our best management practices look like, how we are non-threatening, and how we actually can be seen as a benefit to the work of larger haulers and municipalities as well.
Regarding an article that recently came out that talked about how privileged communities, essentially suburban, middle-class, white people, are actually going to accumulate wealth via climate change, exacerbated natural disasters, and so forth. So I'd really like to introduce into this conversation, as well as in terms of how it's imperative for communities to begin asserting their own sustainability, their own empowerment and protections, as we know that injustice and discrimination will not only continue in the era of climate change, it may very well get stronger.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a matter of not waiting for certain things to be done in our communities, but understanding the power and potential that we have collectively, zip code by zip code, square mile, block by block, in our hands to change certain things. And there's one thing about, wealth and how we look and define wealth, but creating wealth through our soils is one of the best things that I think we can create, whether it's supporting stressed trees in our parkways, eliminating 60 to 95% of groundwater pollutants when it rains, to just the air that it changes, to the even just being able to know your neighbor's name and see each other. I think at the most simplest way of thinking about it, absolutely, it's a matter of really equipping communities of color, disadvantaged communities that don't have the resources of wealthier neighborhoods and communities, with the knowledge, the tools and skills and understanding of what they have and what they can do with it. And we're really seeing communities creating some beautiful spaces that can rival any garden, any green space throughout LA County, just because of them recognizing what they're capable of, as well as understanding that they're not alone in this journey. And there's power in small groups of people doing small acts. We've seen that all throughout time, and we're able to witness it and really be fortunate to partner and just be along for the ride.
I want to talk about expanding our community outside of our human community. And I think it's really just incredibly humbling to think about the multitude of life that exists in a handful of soil or compost, and the billions of species of microorganisms, bacteria, pill bugs, centipedes, worms, etc., that work to break down organic material into nutrient-rich soil. And it's just such an important reminder of the incredible worlds of multi-species critters that provide critical services and uphold the flourishing of life on this planet. And at LA Compost, you talk about nurturing our human communities through these compost hubs and convenings and knowing your neighbors and all of the beautiful pieces that you've shared so far. Similarly, I can't help but think about a passage of Donna Haraway's from her book, Staying with the Trouble, where she writes, quote, "Staying with the trouble requires making odd kin. We require each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations, in hot compost piles. We become with each other or not at all," end quote. And I'm so curious if you're also thinking about the process in terms of making community with our more than human kin. I know you had mentioned the worms, but I would love to hear more about that relationship building aspect as well.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that we know more about, the stars and planets in the sky than the soil beneath our feet, when we as a planet and species depend on the top layer of soil that feeds us all. And the compost pile and the food web and the soil food web is an incredible internet of just multi-leveled micro and macroorganisms, to your point of the bacteria and fungi being the most dominant, to the springtails and ground beetles and the ants and flatworms. And I think we were able to kind of experience these connections at a deeper level through one of our partner organizations and locations. One of our sites is in partnership with the Audubon Center at Debs Park. The Audubon, obviously a national nonprofit that focuses on bird-friendly communities and bird species. And while working at this location, it really was brought to the forefront of the conversation of, although compost isn't kind of aligned with just bird-friendly communities, diving deeper into the conversation, it absolutely was, in the sense that the life in the soil supports the life above the soil, which supports the life in the air. And life is life is life. And when there is life, there is often transfer of life. And we've really seen that from birds around the compost piles to kind of picking around the piles to opening a window and seeing all the life that's in there, to just the beautiful vegetation that has kind of grown partially because of the rains, but also because of the mulch and our overs from the compost pile. And I think without even thinking about it, we've naturally been introduced to the wonderful world of not only the soil food web, but of the web above the soil food web and in the air of the soil food web, and really seeing how it works in harmony and how it works in an urban environment next to the 110 freeway, how it works in a 17-acre park. And, it's really beautiful to know that it's not our efforts that's creating the beautiful, rich compost. It's the efforts of the unseen. It's the efforts of the things with no voices. And I think it's a good reminder of how we should do life and work. We don't always need the recognition and praise. Sometimes it's okay to be behind the scenes, knowing that the collective efforts of those not shouting at the mountaintop of what they're doing are actually making a difference. And whenever we teach workshops, we always want to say soil and compost is all about life. And it's not our efforts with the pitchfork and overalls and, water meter and hose that's doing the work. It's the things that we can't see that are the true superheroes and sheroes of this work, So the soil food web, the micro and macroorganisms deserve the majority of the praise, and us humans get to really learn from the inner workings and really apply this new knowledge learned into other areas and aspects of our lives.
Well, Michael, we've gone through so many different pathways to your work with LA Compost and urban greenings and working with governments and so on and so forth. And I just want to open this space up to you at the end to mention anything that is on your mind or maybe that didn't get mentioned in this conversation.
Yeah, I really am excited to participate and engage with this work, specifically what we'll be working on over the next 3 years, creating more of a district regional model, somewhat of like an ecosystem of building that human network at the individual level, at the community level, and regional level. But compost happens, it happens with us. And I just encourage the listeners to engage with food, engage with people in a deeper and truer way. Connect with your family, your friends, break bread, share meals, but also understand that food is powerful and has a never-ending story and it relates to our journeys as well. So the learning is in the doing. Nature is very forgiving. Coexist well and compost on.
Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. I'd like to thank our podcast production team, our podcast audio producer Andrew Storrs, Francesca Glassbell, our media researcher and writer, Aaron Wise, social media coordination, Hannah Wilton, guest coordination, and Carter Lou McElroy, our music coordinator.
Music in today's show was by Mountain Hood and our very own Carter Lou and One for the Road. Our theme music is Like a River by Kate Wolf.
If you haven't rated us on iTunes, please do so. It really helps spread our message and build our community of earth tenders and defenders.
Wild open sky on the concrete trail.